After 11 years, after every quarter he saved this company, they handed him one folder, and his entire world collapsed. They thought firing him meant the story was over. He was about to prove it had only just begun. One phone call, one decision, and the man they discarded became the one holding all the power. He had one reason to keep fighting ball, and she was sitting right in front of him.
Will we be okay?
We will be okay. He picked up the phone one last time and said 4 words that changed everything. Fire every one of them.
Marcus Cole had exactly 4 minutes to make the biggest sale of his career, and he was going to do it while crouched in a supply closet, because his daughter's school had called during the client's video conference, and he refused to let either of them hear the panic in his voice at the same time. If you have ever had to hold 2 entire lives together with nothing but willpower and a cracked phone screen, stay with me until the end of this video, because what happens to Marcus over the next 3 years will either make you furious or make you believe in justice again. And if this story moves you even a little, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe before we go any further, because you are going to want to see how this ends. Marcus was 39 years old and had been the top salesman at Whitmore Industrial Supply for 3 consecutive years running. Not top 5, not top 10, number 1 every single year by a margin so wide that the next closest salesperson wasn't even in the same conversation. He had built his territory from nothing after his wife Sarah passed away 6 years earlier, throwing himself into work not because he loved the grind, but because his daughter Lily needed shoes, needed braces, needed a roof that didn't leak, and needed a father who showed up to her soccer games, even when he was running on 4 hours of sleep and a gas station coffee. Marcus made it work. He always made it work. That was who he was. The guy who made it work no matter what got thrown at him. Whitmore Industrial Supply was a mid-sized company that sold heavy machinery parts to manufacturing plants across 3 states, and it had survived 2 recessions largely because Marcus refused to let a single client walk away without a reason to stay. He knew every plant manager by name, remembered their kids' birthdays, drove 4 hours through a snowstorm once just to personally deliver a replacement part so a client's assembly line wouldn't shut down. His numbers weren't just good, they were the backbone of the entire sales division, accounting for nearly 40% of the company's annual revenue by himself. Everyone in the building knew it. His manager knew it. The board knew it. Marcus assumed that kind of value meant something. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The company's founder and chairman, Richard Whitmore, was a proud man in his early 60s who had built the business from a single warehouse 30 years earlier. Richard had one daughter, Vanessa, who had spent the last 4 years bouncing between departments, marketing for 8 months, operations for a year, a brief and forgettable stint in logistics, never staying anywhere long, enough to actually learn the business, but always emerging from each role with a fancier title than the one before. Everyone in the office understood the unspoken rule. Vanessa was being groomed, whether she'd earned it or not, and nobody was foolish enough to say it out loud. Marcus wasn't naive. He'd seen the writing on the wall for a while, but he told himself that results mattered more than politics, that no chairman in his right mind would risk 40% of the company's revenue over a family favor. He was about to find out just how wrong that assumption was, too. It happened on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Marcus had just closed the largest single contract of his career the week before, a 3-year supply deal with a manufacturing conglomerate that would have added nearly $2 million in guaranteed annual revenue to the company's books. He walked into the office that morning, expecting congratulations, maybe even the promotion to Senior Regional Director that his manager had been quietly promising him for over a year. Instead, he was called into Richard Whitmore's office and told, without much ceremony, that the company was restructuring the senior sales leadership and that his position was being eliminated effective immediately. Vanessa, he was informed almost as an afterthought, would be stepping into a newly created role, overseeing the entire sales division, the very division Marcus had spent 11 years building with his own hands. Marcus sat there for a long moment, absorbing words that didn't seem to fit together in any order that made sense. He asked, calmly, what had changed. Richard couldn't quite meet his eyes when he answered. He mumbled something about fresh perspective and the next chapter of leadership. But both men in that room understood the real answer, and neither of them said it out loud. Marcus wasn't being let go because of his performance. He was being let go because his success had become inconvenient, because a father who never asked for anything but had earned everything was standing in the way of a daughter who had asked for everything and earned nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. There was a strange, cold clarity that settled over him instead. The kind that comes when you've spent years bracing for a blow you always suspected was coming. He asked for two things before he left. A written confirmation of his final commission payout, which Richard signed without hesitation, clearly relieved that Marcus wasn't going to make a scene, and a single box to pack his desk. He walked out of Whitmore Industrial Supply that afternoon, carrying 11 years of his life, into cardboard box, past co-workers who wouldn't meet his eyes, past the desk where Vanessa was already unpacking a nameplate that read VP of Sales, in gold lettering that had clearly been ordered days in advance. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Marcus sat alone at his kitchen table, with a legal pad and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. He thought about calling his old college roommate, Devon, who had gone into private equity after business school, and had mentioned more than once, half-jokingly, that Marcus should come run sales for one of his portfolio companies whenever he was ready for something bigger. Marcus had always waved it off, loyal to Whitmore in a way that now felt almost embarrassing in hindsight. He picked up his phone and dialed Devon's number. It was nearly 11 at night, but Devon picked up on the second ring, because that's what real friends do. I'm ready, Marcus said simply. Whatever you've got, I'm ready. What Devon offered him wasn't just a sales job. His firm had recently acquired a struggling but promising machinery parts distributor called Ironclad Supply. Smaller than Whitmore, undercapitalized, disorganized, but sitting on a client list and a set of supplier relationships that, in the right hands, could be turned into something formidable. Devon didn't want Marcus to sell for Ironclad. He wanted Marcus to run it as CEO, with a small ownership stake tied directly to performance. It was terrifying. It was also the first time in 11 years that Marcus felt something other than exhaustion when he thought about work. He said yes before he let himself think too hard about the risk. The first year at Ironclad nearly broke him. He was building sales infrastructure, systems, and a culture almost entirely from scratch, all while functioning as a single father to a 10-year-old who still needed help with homework, and still cried some nights missing her mother. There were months where payroll was tight enough that Marcus didn't take a salary at all, quietly covering the gap with what remained of his final commission payout from Whitmore. But he brought the one thing Ironclad had always been missing: relationships built on trust, and a relentless, almost stubborn refusal to let a client walk away without a real reason. Slowly, the client list began to grow. Slowly, word began to spread in an industry that was smaller and more tightly connected than what people realized. By the end of the second year, Ironclad Supply had tripled its revenue. Marcus had rebuilt the sales team from 4 disorganized reps into a disciplined unit of 18, each trained personally in the same relationship-first philosophy that had made him the top seller at Whitmore for 3 straight years. He'd landed 2 of the very manufacturing clients he used to service at his old company, clients who had grown frustrated with the noticeable decline in service quality and follow-through since Vanessa took over the sales division. He didn't gloat about it. He simply took the calls, listened to what those clients needed, and delivered. Meanwhile, back at Whitmore Industrial Supply, the cracks Marcus had once spent years papering over with sheer effort were beginning to show. Vanessa was not, and had never been, a saleswoman. She was skilled at presentations and comfortable in boardrooms, but she had never developed the instinct for reading a client's hesitation, never learned to sit through an uncomfortable silence on a sales call instead of filling it with nervous chatter, never understood that loyalty in this business was earned one difficult, unglamorous moment at a time. Within 18 months of her promotion, 3 of Whitmore's 5 largest accounts had quietly moved their business elsewhere. Revenue, once propped up almost single-handedly by Marcus's 40% contribution, began a slow and then increasingly rapid decline. Richard Whitmore, watching his life's work erode, told himself it was market conditions, told himself it was temporary, told himself anything except the truth that sat uncomfortably close to home. By the start of the third year, Whitmore Industrial Supply was in real trouble. Revenue had fallen nearly 60% from its peak. 2 rounds of layoffs had gutted departments that once hummed with activity. The bank holding their operating line of credit had begun asking pointed questions during quarterly reviews. Richard, now visibly older and more worn than the man who had once sat across from Marcus and mumbled about fresh perspective, found himself in a position he never imagined, quietly meeting with investment bankers to explore a sale of the company, because it was becoming increasingly clear that Whitmore Industrial Supply, as it stood, would not survive another 2 years. The investment bank tasked with finding a buyer ran a confidential process, reaching out to strategic acquirers and private equity firms who might have interest in the machinery parts distribution space. One of the firms that expressed serious interest was Devon's firm, the same firm that now owned Ironclad Supply, and the same firm whose portfolio company had, over the past 3 years, quietly become one of the most respected and fastest-growing players in the exact market Whitmore used to dominate. When the target list came across Devon's desk, and he saw the name Whitmore Industrial Supply, he didn't say a word to Marcus at first. He simply picked up the phone and asked for a meeting with the seller's advisors, because a distressed acquisition at the right price, folded into Ironclad's now thriving operations, made obvious financial sense regardless of any history involved. It was during the second round of diligence meetings that Richard Whitmore walked into a conference room and saw Marcus Cole sitting at the head of the table, flanked by Devon and 2 associates from the private equity firm, reviewing Whitmore's financials with the calm, unhurried authority of a man who already understood exactly how much trouble the company he built was in. For a long moment, Richard simply stood in the doorway, unable to fully process what he was looking at. The last time he'd seen Marcus, the man had been carrying a cardboard box out of this same building. Now Marcus was sitting on the other side of a negotiating table, holding, quite literally, the future of the company Richard had spent 30 years building. Nobody in that room said anything cruel. Marcus didn't gloat, didn't bring up the firing, didn't need to say a single word about vindication, because the numbers on the table said everything that needed to be said. He simply extended his hand to Richard, the same steady handshake he'd given hundreds of clients over the years, and said that he was glad to finally be sitting across from him again, under whatever circumstances brought them there. Richard, to his credit, shook Marcus's hand, and something passed between the 2 men that didn't have a Prachany translation. An old debt quietly being acknowledged, even if it could never be repaid the way it should have been. The acquisition negotiations stretched over several weeks. Devon's firm ultimately structured a deal to acquire Whitmore Industrial Supply's assets and fold them into Ironclad Supply, creating a combined company with a client base and operational footprint larger than Whitmore had ever achieved, even at its peak. As part of the transition plan, Marcus, now CEO of the combined entity, was given full authority over restructuring the leadership team. It was during this process that he made the phone call that would define the next chapter of his career. A call to Devon simply confirming what needed to happen with the existing Whitmore executive team who had presided over the company's collapse. The same team, including Vanessa, who had never developed the skills or the humility the job actually required. "Fire every one of them," Marcus said, without malice, without triumph, simply stating a business decision that had been 3 years in the making. It wasn't revenge. It was just, finally, the truth being allowed to matter again. Richard Whitmore, for his part, was offered a quiet advisory role, a graceful exit that preserved some dignity for the man who had built something real once, even if he'd nearly destroyed it by choosing blood over merit. Vanessa was not retained in any capacity, and the last anyone heard, she had moved into a completely different industry, away from the shadow of a company that bore her family's name, but no longer needed her presence to survive. Marcus never framed any of it as revenge, not to his team, not to the press when a regional business journal ran a feature on the turnaround, and certainly not to Lily, who was now 13 and had watched her father rebuild an entire company from nothing, while still never missing a single soccer game or school recital. What he told her instead, sitting at their kitchen table on the night the acquisition officially closed, was simpler than any speech about vindication or justice. He told her that sometimes people will decide you don't matter, and the only real answer to that isn't anger. It's becoming so undeniably good at what you do, that the truth eventually finds its own way to the surface, whether anyone wants it to or not. Lily, who had inherited her father's steady eyes and her mother's quiet strength, simply nodded and asked if this meant they could finally take that vacation he'd been promising her for 3 years. Marcus laughed, for the first time in longer than he could remember, and told her yes, they absolutely could. 3 years after being handed a cardboard box and a termination letter for the crime of being too valuable to a chairman who valued family loyalty more than the company he'd then spent his life building, Marcus Cole sat in the corner office of a company that now bore his fingerprints in every department, having built something real out of nothing but persistence, integrity, and a stubborn refusal to let one bad decision define the rest of his story. Some people get fired and it breaks them. Marcus got fired, and 3 years later, he was the one deciding who got to stay.